Today it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Philip Blake, who is an associate professor and acting program chair of the Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies program at the Middlebury Institute. Professor Blake is devoting his career to the study and the control of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. He earned a master's degree in public policy from Harvard and his PhD in government from Georgetown. And while he was doing his doctoral work, he also taught at Georgetown. He joined the Middlebury Institute in 2011, and a few years ago he also took a one-year leave from Middlebury to serve as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear, chemical, and biological defense weapons, and of course that was in Washington, D.C. Well, we asked him if he would meet with us today to talk about some of his recent work, and we're very grateful that he agreed to do so. He has entitled his presentation, Chemical Weapons, They're Horrible but Also Hopeful, Past, Present, and Future. And I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming him.
So I work on some very dark topics, though certainly I have no monopoly in terms of working on dark topics, and Yemen that you'll hear about, it sounds like at your next meeting, is certainly one of those. But it's nice to crawl out of the bunker and have a chance to engage regular folks. I really like talking to generalist audiences about the things that I work on. I'm a nuclear, biological, chemical policy generalist. So I have a PhD in political science. I don't have a technical background, but I work on a lot of issues that are at the intersection of technical and politics and policy issues. For example, I was just last week in Washington, D.C. giving a talk at the National Defense University about the implications of microfluidics, chip-scale chemistry for chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons threats. That's actually about as far as I go. That's pretty far out on the kind of technical spectrum in terms of the things that I work on. I wanted to talk to you today about chemical weapons. It feels to me, and I think probably to you as well, like chemical weapons are back in the news in the last couple of years and even the last couple of months in ways that are kind of provide a nice opportunity to sort of think back about how we got here, what the history of chemical weapons is, and what both the past and the present of chemical weapons look like, and what some of the implications of that are for the potential future of chemical weapons. When I say that they're back in the news, I mean specifically the bizarre episode that happened in Salisbury in the UK, where a former Russian spy who was living in the UK was apparently targeted, apparently in a Russian government-sanctioned operation with Novichok, actually a word that for a long time was... I have to be careful, I should say right up front, this is a really good time for the disclaimer. Everything I say here reflects only my personal views and none of the views or positions of any of my current or past employers or funders. But Novichok, allegedly a Russian-developed next-generation nerve agent, and actually I think there's a theme here around the potential future use of chemical weapons that I want to circle back to. I just want to flag that kind of bizarre incident where these two individuals, apparently cathedral-loving tourists, and you read some of the nuances around this, traveled to Salisbury, perhaps neglected to view the cathedrals at all, and contaminated the doorknob of a home with this Soviet nerve agent. Syria, over the last couple of years, has obviously put chemical weapons into the news in a very significant way, and that's a larger scale use. That's quite different than that Novichok episode, something that I was personally very directly involved in the sense that during that year, 2012-2013, when I served in the Pentagon, I staffed an interagency group, unusual Pentagon-based interagency group, that specifically worked on Syrian chemical weapons. And part of what I want to talk to you today about is that experience. And I want to share the way in which we thought about Syrian chemical weapons and how we thought they mattered, and also just talk a little bit about what we did in response to the ways in which we thought they mattered, and in response to the ways in which we thought they might manifest in that conflict, and in part, they in fact did. And I'm free to talk a little bit about that, because in the aftermath of that story, the Obama administration made a lot of it public. And I ended up getting a grant from a sub-agency of the Department of Defense to do a lessons learned study about that whole experience. And having served on the inside and worked it at the classified level, I was in a really unique position, again, outside government, coming back here as a faculty member, to do that work because I knew the people who had worked on it, and I knew the questions to ask, I suppose. I don't know if I knew why the skeletons were buried, but that was a really remarkable experience, and something that I'll talk about a little bit today. Another episode where chemical weapons have been in the news recently, in last year, I think it was February of 2017, there was again this sort of bizarre episode where the half-brother of the current ruler of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, was assassinated in Malaysia with VX, another nerve agent. We'll talk a little more about nerve agents and other forms of chemical weapons. Binary nerve agent that was smeared on his face by these two women, and that whole story was sort of surreal, and that too feeds into one of the themes that I want to emphasize for you. I thought it might be useful right up front to sort of ask the question, what's a chemical weapon? And that might seem like a silly question. Sort of like, well, I know what a chemical weapon is. Show me one and I'll tell you what it is. I actually think it has sort of interesting analogies to that famous Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart quote, I know it when I see it, which referred to the distinction between pornography and art. Art, classic paintings being full of naked ladies and sometimes naked gentlemen, and being something that we feel comfortable labeling art within the particular social context that we operate in, and then pornography, something that most of us think is we sort of know it when we see it, but it turns out on paper, in a formal sense, to be remarkably difficult to define the differences. And chemical weapons are a little bit like that, I think. There are a lot of chemicals that are used on the battlefield. Explosives that explode and injure people by exploding are chemicals, but they are not considered chemical weapons. So the Chemical Weapons Convention, and we'll get to that in this narrative, defines chemical weapons as chemical substances that, through their chemical action, injure or kill human beings. And I'm condensing it a little bit. In other words, explosives that explode are not chemical weapons, but pepper spray, which through its chemical action directly irritates human tissues, is technically a chemical weapon. So there's this sort of maximally broad definition, and then there's a kind of a carve-out for domestic riot control agents. And one of the things that does is create some interesting gray zones. When we get to the future of chemical weapons, that's something I want to circle back to, because there's some gray zones around what is and isn't a chemical weapon, and how we think about some of the things, and in particular, incapacitants. Substances that might be used not to kill, but to incapacitate people. For example, in counterterrorism operations, like in the early 2000s, the Russians did in the Moscow theater hijacking, that are a little bit in a gray zone in terms of how we think about chemical weapons, and that may be challenging both for the kind of legal and normative structure that we've built up, and our efforts to kind of continue to or keep chemical weapons as marginalized as we have. Chemical weapons are interesting, and I briefly want to touch on how I think about sort of their sort of utility and lack thereof, and then dive back into some specific experiences and some of the specific examples I've already flagged. So chemical weapons are poisons, basically. Usually when we think about chemical weapons, we think about synthetically produced substances, but actually organically produced substances are technically count, at least under the Chemical Weapons Convention, as chemical weapons as well. So they're poisons. A lot of them are liquids, actually. This term gas is used liberally, like you'll hear sarin gas. Sarin is overwhelmingly in a liquid form that are disseminated as aerosols or as droplets over some area. And one thing just to flag is just having the substance doesn't entail a weapon. So delivery turns out to be a really sort of additional challenge that is quite challenging in the chemical domain. And part of what limits the effectiveness of chemical weapons on the battlefield are some of these challenges around delivery. Chemical weapons are particularly effective against unprotected, less sophisticated populations. In particular, dense populations, and in particular, in contained spaces. So the nightmare scenario of the use of chemical weapons is something like the subway. Imagine the subway at rush hour. It's packed with bodies, they have a hard time getting away, it's contained, so the chemical agent doesn't dissipate. And actually there's a particular example of that happening during rush hour in a packed subway, which is the Japanese Aum Shinrikyo cult, which in the early 1990s, culminating in 1995 in an attack on the Tokyo subway during rush hour, released sarin, ended up killing, the way in which they disseminated it was very crude, ended up killing only 14 people. Usually the death toll is described as 13 or 14, depending on there's an individual who survived for a while and finally expired. And then affecting directly a couple hundred more and sending thousands of people to the hospital. One of the unusual experiences I had farther back was I was part of the only study, to the best of my knowledge, that has ever debriefed the Monterey terrorists, including the ones on death row, who you may have read just a couple weeks ago, the Japanese government finally, 2 decades later, executed for their crime, in particular that Tokyo subway attack. I was part of the only study that debriefed them about their biological weapons program. Because their biological weapons program, unlike their chemical weapons program, failed. They didn't manage to injure anyone. They were wildly incompetent in really fascinating ways, and that's a sort of interesting story. And they're one of those stories where if you sort of saw the movie, you'd be like, well, this is ridiculous. It's so implausible, sort of so bizarre. It's one of those truth is stranger than fiction kind of dynamics. But they had more success with chemical weapons. And they used chemical weapons in part, in particular in that context, in a way that could maximize their effectiveness. And that's one of the things I want to come back to too, is thinking a little bit about that non-state actor threat. Because in a lot of respects, chemical weapons threats are less likely to emerge from states, with some important caveats that I want to circle back to. But in the future, they're maybe more likely to emerge in non-state milieux, and that includes a spectrum of threats from things that are quite crude to things that are potentially more sophisticated. So, with all of that kind of set up front, let's sort of jump back historically and talk a little bit about the emergence of this threat. So, chemical poisons are not new in warfare or the conduct of politics, right? And I picture this medieval scene where someone opens their ring with the compartment and pours something into someone's wine, and the king is poisoned or whatever it is, or like Game of Thrones style. There's nothing very modern about that. What is modern, what chemical warfare is a combination of developments in chemistry in the 1800s into the 1900s and the Industrial Revolution. So the ability both to identify substances and to make them in large, very pure volumes. And chemical weapons emerged fundamentally in the context of World War II, in the context of the sort of tactical dilemmas around trench warfare, when it was harder to directly target people, and you could soften them up so that you could then attack them with conventional weapons, using chemical weapons. And there was this very rapid sort of tactical innovation that happened in World War II, where there were, I think, the first use. Sorry, I meant, thank you, World War I. I saw a finger go up, and I thought, oh, someone's got a question. I'm going to circle back to that later. Thank you. So I'm a little sleep deprived. I won't, well, perhaps in part because we have a three-nager in our life, and he had a challenging night last night, and the last couple nights. But he's his own weapon of mass destruction in his own special way. So World War I, they emerged on the battlefields of World War I, and then there's very quick escalation. I think the French were the first to use what was actually more of a riot control agent, and there was also a kind of innovation around both the use of them, to include the delivery of them, and also the development of new chemicals to use on the battlefields of World War I. So you saw what we consider sort of first-generation chemical weapons emerge in that context. In particular, tier agents that are more like riot control agents, and then the choking agents. So you think of chlorine, for example, as a sort of first-generation weapon, and something more recently in Syria that we've seen used again, and I want to circle back to that when we talk about Syria in a little bit, and then phosG and the next-generation choking agent and some other substances that were used as well on the World War I battlefield. Efforts horror around chemical weapons and efforts to marginalize them predate World War I, actually. So in the Hague Conventions, there are efforts to agree to, so more broadly, we have this long history of trying to, you might call it civilized war, of trying to sort of curb the worst excesses of war. And that's controversial, right? Some people think that that's desirable, and actually that it's worth celebrating ways in which, as human beings, we've been able to say, although we continue to have violence, and we are not able at this point to eliminate violence, we can curb some of its worst excesses. But as you might imagine, others will say that in the context of the broader horrors of war, that's actually not very meaningful, that it can actually be a distraction, or there can be a sort of a false narrative that we have sort of overly civilized war while ignoring some of its horrors. As part of that broader effort, there was an effort very early on to try to build norms around and to try to marginalize chemical weapons, not very effectively early on, and then increasingly effectively over time. So that predates World War I, and then after World War I, and that kind of searing experience of the very, very large-scale use of chemical weapons, and something that a lot of people directly experienced in this sort of horrors of that. There was then a sort of follow-on effort to, in a more robust way, establish these norms and marginalize chemical weapons more, but in a way that had, it's difficult actually to assess the effectiveness of that, but in a way that at most had limited effectiveness. And then after World War II, you have the continued development of various chemical agents and actually very substantial investment in chemical weapons capabilities by various countries, but only relatively limited use. Now, I say that, there's some really important caveats to that. For example, during the 1980s when Iran and Iraq fought a horrific and very drawn-out war, Saddam Hussein used very, very extensive chemical weapons against the Iranians, and there are a number of other episodes where chemical weapons were used. One of the things that's, jumping back for a sec, that's interesting about World War II is that in the European theater, both the Allies and the Axis powers had substantial chemical weapons that they had actually prepared for potential use on the battlefield, and either didn't use or used only in very limited ways. And there's actually an interesting sort of historical puzzle there about why that is. And one of the theories, which gets a fair bit of traction empirically, I think, is that there was a deterrence dynamic. So the Germans in particular feared that if they crossed this line, the Americans would themselves cross the line and use chemical weapons in response, and I think that was an accurate fear. And in fact, the Americans stockpiled chemical weapons in the theater as a way to be able to respond to potential attacks by the Germans. The Germans did, in limited ways, use chemical weapons in their fight with the Russians, though in somewhat limited ways. And then the Imperial Japan used chemical weapons on a much larger scale, in particular against both combatants and civilian populations in its conflict in China. So there was some use in that conflict, but in the European theater, limited. There's obviously a really big caveat to that, and it's not on the battlefield, but the Nazis obviously employed poison gas in their chambers in a way that was that is utterly horrifying, and that if you count that as a use of chemical weapons, is far and away the largest, the most consequential use of chemical weapons that's ever occurred. So after World War II, there's there isn't a focus at that point on chemical threats, in part because you have the emergence of nuclear weapons, and in the superpower dynamic that emerges between the US and the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons and trying to cope with the dangers, at first sort of stuff the atomic genie back into the bottle, and then at least manage it when it's clear that it's not going back into the bottle. In that context, chemical weapons get less attention, and various countries, very much to include the United States and the Soviet Union, build up quite robust chemical arsenals. And then you have this period of time where chemical weapons are they're relatively marginalized in international politics, but episodically they get used again. And one of the big kind of outlier cases here is that 1980s case where Saddam Hussein uses them on a very large scale against the Iraqis, and then also he uses them against Kurdish populations, in particular undefended civilian populations, in really, really horrifying ways. And as in part, nuclear weapons, arms control advances, and there's a sense that the nuclear domain has been kind of addressed, and then in the interim, there's actually efforts to address biological weapons. So chemical weapons early on were lumped together, so early efforts to restrict chemical and biological weapons addressed both of them. And then you have, in the 70s, the Biological Weapons Convention, where states commit to not use biological weapons, in part in the context of a perception that they are less battlefield usable, that they're less desirable, and also that they're weapons of the weak. I think there's a sense that for the powerful states, that even if they have better biological weapons, they are more constrained by the existence of biological weapons in others' hands than they are empowered even by more powerful biological capabilities. And biological weapons have a lot of challenges associated with using them on the battlefield, like latency, the possibility that there'll be blowback, especially if we're talking about contagious agents that can spread between human beings once they're affected. So there's a lot of ways in which biological weapons are. And the stigma around biological weapons is also particularly acute. They're sort of particularly horrifying to people in a way where it's easier to build a norm around them and marginalize them in international politics. And when the Biological Weapons Convention is negotiated in the 70s, one of the things it explicitly calls for is the subsequent negotiation of a Chemical Weapons Convention. So something analogous, even at a time when a lot of states are deeply invested in chemical weapons. And finally, by the early 1990s, you have the negotiation. So the negotiations basically happen during the American presidency of George H.W. Bush, and he himself plays an interesting and key role in that, in part because of his prior experience as a vice president, and that's a little side note we don't need to go deeply into, but it's an interesting historical wrinkle. And then they're concluded at the very beginning of the Bill Clinton presidency, and in 1997, you have the Chemical Weapons Convention come into effect, and it's an international agreement that bans all aspects of chemical weapons, as previously did the Biological Weapons Convention, but different than, for example, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is this sort of unusual arrangement that allows some parties to keep nuclear weapons while making a commitment to eventually work toward their disarmament. So in the chemical domain, the Chemical Weapons Convention is an unequivocal commitment not to be in the business of chemical weapons, not to research them, not to stockpile them, not to use them. This completely covers the spectrum. And in 1997, there are a number of states who still have chemical weapons, and so as part of their joining that agreement, they make a commitment within 10 years under the auspices of an organization that set up the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to supervise that dismantlement. They make a commitment to disarm their chemical weapons. And all the states that have chemical weapons in 1997 at entry into force of the Chemical Weapons Convention do that within the 10 years, except for the United States and Russia. And it's actually not that the United States and Russia were necessarily dragging their feet, it's that they had very large stockpiles. There were both technical and political challenges associated with this destruction. I mean, if you're sort of aware of the environmental reviews that happen around potential desalination on the Monterey Peninsula, imagine what the environmental review process looks like and the politics look like when someone says, oh, by the way, down the street, we're going to build a facility to demilitarize. So the politics of that have been very, very charged in the United States, and that's part of the reason why, as of today, we are actually the only state that has not met its commitments under the Chemical Weapons Convention. We're almost there. Russia got there last year, and they hold that over our heads a little bit, and that's a little unfair because we actually funded the facility at a place called Chucha, where they did the bulk of their chemical weapons demilitarization. So it's a little unfair that Putin lords that over us, but he does, and we're almost there. So in a lot of respects, that's a really remarkable success story. And there's been this sort of marginalization of chemical weapons, and I think that's something that's worth celebrating. But then there are these important exceptions to it. And Syria is a really important exception to it. And one interesting question is how to sort of read that exception. So the Syrian Civil War, we'll spend a couple of minutes diving into that. So the Syrian Civil War started in 2011. So there was this sort of regional instability that spread to various countries, and eventually it spread to Syria, and in part because the Syrian regime cracked down very aggressively on the sort of early emergence of those kind of protest dynamics that actually ended up fanning the flames. As a side note, this is a little creepy, but I'm going to say it anyway, it's analytically really interesting to think about optimal dictator strategy. Like, do you crack down, does it mean to crack down too hard, and what does it mean to crack down too lightly? You might argue that the Egyptian government cracked down too lightly, and things got out of control. And I mean that, there's a huge asterisk on that, which is that there's a moral dynamic here that I'm sort of ignoring and making light of in a way that's not entirely appropriate. But in Syria, the Syrian regime cracked down very brutally. In particular, you may remember the boys who drew anti-Assad graffiti on walls and were held and brutally tortured and returned to their families, and that in part helped spark what became a really widespread civil war in Syria. In the US government, there was concern from the beginning about the ways in which chemical weapons that we thought Syria possessed might come into play in that conflict. So Syria is one of the very few countries that didn't join that overwhelming international norm formalized in the Chemical Weapons Convention. So Syria wasn't a party to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and in fact, it had a fairly robust stockpile of chemical weapons as a kind of a poor man's deterrent vis-a-vis Israel, both Israel's conventional capabilities and Israel's nuclear capabilities. At least that's what analytically we think was the primary motivation behind Syria having that capability. In case you're curious, by the way, the other significant outliers here are North Korea, which probably won't surprise anyone, in part given some of the recent and not so recent dynamics in that country, and Egypt, which is a kind of interesting historical example where Egypt is thought to possess some kind of a modest chemical weapons deterrent, as again a sort of a poor man's or poor person's, not to be sexist, nuclear deterrent vis-a-vis Israel as well. So Egypt made a commitment to nuclear non-proliferation in in part as Israel was pursuing and obtained a nuclear weapons capability, and chemical weapons are sort of a fallback capability that they possess, though what they possess, I think, in the public domain, we have very little sense of. But Syria is this country that had this fairly substantial chemical arsenal, and so as this conflict erupted, we were concerned about that. This was before I went into government in August of 2012. So before I went into government, one of the things that happened is that there was a dedicated effort set up within the U.S. intelligence community to try to track in a more granular way what was happening with Syrian chemical weapons, right? We wanted good intelligence on what was going on there. And we had intelligence assessments of their capabilities that in retrospect look really good. One of the fascinating things is we had around the 2003 Iraq War this debacle around WMD intelligence. And I think the intelligence community learned a lot of lessons from that. As a policymaker consuming intelligence products, one of the things that was really striking to me was how careful the community was in the aftermath of that experience to characterize confidence levels associated with certain judgments. That's something that is widely... 2003 obviously has a political dynamic as well, but there were problems with the underlying intelligence, even though there's a kind of a separate issue of the way in which it may have been politicized and misinterpreted and read in a way that was maybe not entirely inappropriate. So it turns out, looking back, that we actually had very good intelligence about Syrian, or look, we think we had very good intelligence about Syrian chemical weapons capabilities. So early on, there was this effort that was stood up. And then there was a whole kind of set of efforts that grew, and in part, they grew sort of organically to, for example, talk to allies and friendly states. So we had very active conversations with states in the region, like Turkey and Jordan, who were concerned and who might be on the front lines of coping with a chemical incident. We had very extensive conversations with our NATO allies. There was eventually a dialogue that sprung up that I was part of, that was a White House-led initiative to engage the Russians at a fairly senior level and then push down to the working level, where we engaged the Russians on how we might cooperate if given the opportunity on Syrian chemical weapons, and the Russians were willing to compartmentalize that issue in a way that allowed us to have a fruitful conversation with them. Actually, this is I think one of the most fascinating wrinkles. The way in which we were able to engage them in that conversation was to keep saying the words, if asked. In other words, as long as we kept saying, if asked by the current Syrian administration to help them cope with their chemical weapons, how might we, the US and Russia, aid them? If asked by them, how might we do that? As long as we kept saying that, the Russians were willing to have very substantive conversations with us about chemical weapons, which ended up in interesting ways laying the foundation for what came later when we had this opportunity to work in particular with Russia, but also with a broader coalition on demilitarizing those capabilities. So from the beginning of the conflict, there was concern. And then in the fall into the winter of 2012, we started to see these small episodes of chemical weapons use. And they were really small. A dozen people affected, half a dozen people affected, and you had, for example, blood samples that were being smuggled out of Syria that we could test to look for the decomposition products associated with people who've been exposed to various agents. And that was surprising to us to see that. And the reason it was surprising to us was that when we thought about this threat and the way in which it might manifest, we thought about three potential threats. One, we thought about the Syrian regime using chemical weapons against others in that region. Perhaps, for example, imagine that Turkey did something, incurred across the border, or involved itself in that conflict in a way that crossed red lines for the Syrians. We'll circle back to the Obama red line in a little bit. That's obviously in its own right a really contentious issue. So you could imagine Syria using chemical weapons against Israel, or against Turkey, or against Jordan, or against others. That was a concern, but I think we felt that the Syrian regime was relatively deterrable, that it was unlikely to do that absent some set of dire circumstances, so we couldn't rule it out. There was concern that the Syrian regime would lose control of these capabilities, and at times, as the conflict ebbed and flowed, you had various groups of non-state actors controlling very, very significant parts of Syrian territory. It has now flowed back in the other direction, and the regime has essentially won that conflict, but that wasn't the case at the time. And so there was a fear around those actors seizing chemical weapons and perhaps using them in the theater, perhaps using them somewhere in the region, or perhaps maybe a little more far-fetched, using them outside the region elsewhere to support terrorist attacks. And actually one of the dilemmas that we grappled with was, as you know, there was a particular slice of those non-state actors who were fighting the Assad regime who we were supporting in various ways, and the character of that support has morphed over time. But one of the ways in which we supported them was to give them things like gas masks and to give them some, albeit limited, intelligence to, for example, be able to avoid certain facilities. And one of our concerns, and maybe a little more in the mode of admiring the problem than having really good solutions to it, was that they might use that, both material and that information that we shared with them, to try to seize Syrian chemical weapons. So that was a very live concern that that was an active part of our conversations. So through the fall and winter and into the spring, you have these sort of smaller scale episodes. And of the third thing we were concerned about was the possibility of the Syrian regime using chemical weapons internally in that conflict. And we were, I think it's fair to say, though I really should speak only for myself, less concerned about that, because I think the perception was that the regime had less to gain and more to lose from doing that. That it wasn't clear that it gave it a lot of advantage, and that it was quite risky, actually. You know, the international community had, and this itself was a really contested issue, but the international community in many respects gave the Syrian regime a lot of leeway to do some really horrific things. And one of the ways in which they might get more significant pushback was to cross that line and to use chemical weapons, and that obviously is what then occurred. And still, I will say, to me, it's a little bit puzzling why they did that. I can tell stories around it. I have sort of hypotheses, but I think it's interesting whether we'll be able to eventually get sort of better data. One of the few positive things to come out of the 2003 war in Iraq, well, aside from the fact that a really appalling dictator and his even more appalling, perhaps, sons were toppled from power, one of the very few positive things that came out of that conflict is that we seized the internal files of the Iraqi government. And those were made available to people like me. And so some of my colleagues have done really fascinating work to try to understand, well, what were Saddam Hussein's motivations to try to get nuclear weapons? How did he think about the deterrent threats that we made against him in the context of those conflicts? And some of those questions and some of those questions we get less traction on with those documents. But maybe someday we'll have that kind of insight into Syria, but we don't for now. And then you have these smaller scale episodes into the spring of 2013. And then on August 21st, 2013, we have the episode, and a lot of you will remember, where in the suburbs of Damascus, there was this very, very large scale use of chemical weapons. And it unequivocally transgressed the series of red lines that President Obama had articulated, which were sort of versions of, I don't want to see large-scale movement and or large-scale use of chemical weapons, and if I see that, that will change my calculus. So he said versions of that in different fora, in slightly different ways. And I will say, so some of my friends, so I served under Senator Obama in 2008 on his foreign policy team, and then had this chance to go into his administration. But I was a little cog in that administration. So some of my friends have asked me, what President Obama thought and the red line. And I was in rooms with President Obama twice that entire time I was in government, and we exchanged 0 words. So I speak for myself here, but I was also a really little cog in the machine. And one of the things that I think some of my friends who haven't served in government don't totally understand is the lack of transparency even within government, right? So I was not deeply knowledgeable even about what my Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, was saying in rooms with President Obama. President Obama had articulated this red line. And there was a perception in particular, and the administration encouraged this perception, that there would be a military response, that some of the consequences would be military. And so when this attack happened, then the administration actually telegraphed and prepared for that military response. So there was a widespread sense that we were about to launch cruise missiles, basically. That's our sort of default, relatively less risky way of imposing some pain. Secretary Kerry famously called it a pinprick strike, and then our military officials said we don't do pinprick strikes. A sort of a limited way of imposing some pain, and you might argue actually fairly symbolic, but it would have had somewhat degraded Syrian chemical weapons capabilities. And then President Obama hesitated, and he hesitated in part because the British Parliament decided not to join the coalition. So you had an American and what would have been a bilateral American-French effort to enact military consequences on the Syrians. And in the context of this hesitation, this possibility of a deal emerged, where through their Russian partners, the Syrian regime, and it's still unclear to me actually, to what degree the Syrian regime was sort of coerced into this bargain by Russia, and to what extent they were sort of willing participants, and it'd be interesting whether eventually we get more clarity on that. The Syrian regime offered to give up its chemical weapons capabilities. And then we had this remarkable international effort where this international coalition, basically the Syrian regime joined the Chemical Weapons Convention in an expedited way and declared what they had, and inspectors inspected facilities, and there was pushback on their initial declaration and they amended it. That's standard. Every country that has joined the Chemical Weapons Convention has gone through that process and has had anomalies in its initial declaration, but it was all expedited. And it happened in the middle of this ongoing war. So one of the challenges associated with that was, how do you keep OPCW inspectors safe? Right? How do you have them in convoys where they can travel to facilities that they need to be able to verify the dismantlement of? So you have this international effort, and one of the fascinating wrinkles is that no country was willing to host the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons. So the United States has fairly robust chemical weapons destruction capabilities that we're now using to finish the demilitarization of our capabilities. Russia has very extensive capabilities. Some other countries have capabilities as well, some more in the industrial commercial space and some more on the military side. Politically, this was a really charged issue. Albania almost agreed. Albania actually is a country that had chemical weapons, that the United States assisted Albania to demilitarize that. It's one of the countries that demilitarized a chemical weapons stockpile under the Chemical Weapons Convention. They almost agreed, and then there were huge protests in the street. This became a kind of very charged environmental issue. So ultimately, we had no place to do this. And so we ended up doing it on an American ship in international waters. And it was kind of this remarkable operation where this technology was installed, a technology that my team had helped develop. So I'm jumping around a little bit here, but another kind of fascinating wrinkle here is we didn't in the United States, and none of our partners had, a mobile bulk agent chemical weapons destruction capability. So we had these big, multiple $100 million facilities at particular locations that demilitarized chemical weapons. And then we had small mobile capabilities to be able to, for example, take artillery shells off the battlefield and detonate them with explosives and capture the off gases, sometimes colloquially called bang boxes. But we had nothing in between. So the Syrian arsenal we assessed, it was correct. It was mostly in bulk form. It wasn't already in munitions. That made it much easier to destroy it. A lot of it was in precursor form. So it was chemicals that, when combined, make the agent. It's much safer to store chemical agents, and it's also, you have longer shelf lives if you make the agent either in the process of filling munition, or in some sophisticated munitions actually mix it as you fire the munition to make fresh, if you will, a fresh batch of chemical agent as the munition is actually firing. We had no ability to destroy that outside these existing land-based facilities that politically became clear we weren't going to be able to use. And so we developed a new technology called the Field Deployable Hydrolysis System. So in general, in government, the more generic something's named, the more exciting it is. That's been my experience. So I staffed the senior integration group, and technically, actually, the Syria Chemical Weapons Senior Integration Group. And there's a lot of really interesting sort of government internal dynamics that happened within that and under that sort of generic name. Actually, I was part of the Syria Senior Integration Group Action Group. So you have this sort of bizarre proliferation of acronyms and bureaucratic structures. But we developed in 6 months an operational prototype based on very conservative principles of this technology that ended up being used to destroy the bulk of the Syrian chemical arsenal by a process called hydrolysis, so basically cleaving the chemical bonds in the presence of water. And some of you, again, I'm a political scientist, and some of you have hard science backgrounds. So depending on the questions that you ask me about that, if you do, you may push me to the limits of my knowledge. One of my favorite factoids about this technology is that at one point we asked, how clean does the water have to be that we use to, right, because this question of, in particular, can you use brackish water, could you use seawater? And the kind of cute answer that we got back before they actually answered our question was, number 1, okay, number 2, not okay.